We will call the September meeting of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee to order. Without objection, we will take a look at our consent agenda. Are there any items on consent that any members of the committee or council present would have pulled? I do have, for Councilman McIntosh, item C2. Are there any others? I would like to pull C18. Staff has stated that C9 has been brought into compliance. That is listed on our agenda. And so with that one, I ask that we will pull that from the agenda as it's been brought into compliance. And then I understand that there's someone here to speak on item C15. Are there any other individuals present to speak on any of the demolition items that are listed outside of C15? What property is that?
C12.
C12. Yes, sir. C17. Okay. I have items C15, C12, and C17 to be pulled.
C2 and C18.
On the demolition.
Yeah.
Mr. Brooks, is there another? C15? Yep, got that. All right. So we will pull off item C9 as it's been brought into compliance, pull off items C15, C12, and C17, and then items by council members 18 and 2. If there are none others, there 12. Yeah.
I'll make a motion that we approve the balance.
Is there a second? All right. All those in favor? All right. All right, moving first to item C2. Item C2.
Information regarding bee-friendly community.
Is there someone, a staff person, speak on this item?
I'll be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Mr. McIntosh?
Yeah, I'm an avid reader of National Geographic, so I've kind of been aware of the problem that we're having with bee colony collapse. And I listened to an excellent podcast on municipal equation. For any of you municipal government junkies out there, it's a really, really good podcast. But it went into all the reasons why it makes sense to encourage bee colonies in cities. And so I asked staff to take a look into it and come back to us with some information on it, as far as what it would take for us to become a bee city.
Okay. This is information.
Correct.
All right. Okay. So, Mr. Clark?
A question, do we know of other cities, is there a template we could follow on this?
Yes, sir. There are other cities in North Carolina and across the country that have done this.
Okay.
Mr. Larson?
And there is a membership fee somewhere, $1,000. Is that what we're dealing
I
with?
believe that's right, yeah.
Yeah,
Based on community size.
not much.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Moving along to item C12.
Item C12, Bridge Investment Group, LLC, 1529 Pleasant Street, located in the Southeast Ward. Ordinance ordering the demolition and removal of a structure for repairs less than 50% of value of the structure.
Thank you. This case will show that on the history page, staff has done due diligence. The list pendants for the violations were filed on June 6, 2016. The property became eligible for demolition March 1st of 2016, and it is a minus 50 case.
All right, and there is someone here to speak on this item C12. Won't you come to the podium and give your name and your address for the record?
Julian Wayne Rory, and my address is 3751 Sawyer Drive.
Okay, if we take action today in terms of approving what staff has recommended to us, that would enact a 90-day time frame prior to demolition of the property. Is your intention to repair the property? And
Well,
if so, will that be a sufficient amount of time to do so?
Yes, sir. That's my intention. I brought pictures of the repairs. I'm supposed to get it inspected, and I'm waiting for them to come inspect it. I called them and set up an appointment.
When did you call and make the appointment?
Well, I've been calling all last week, and I finally got them to call me back. I didn't know that the guy that originally wrote it up is not the one that's handling it now. So when I found that out, I called. Well, actually, he put me in touch with the other guy today, and I made the appointment today.
So is your statement and belief that the property, you're making repairs, if we move forward where we are now, 90 days would be given for the repairs have been stated here?
Yes, sir.
Is that a sufficient time for you to do what you need to have done?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. For the committee, any questions?
And I'll just say Mr. Brooks is here if you want to coordinate with him on getting somebody out to check it again.
Okay.
All right, so make sure you see one of the staff members before you leave out. Okay. What's the pleasure of the committee?
To approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
That's been moved. Is there a second?
I hit motion, nobody. Okay, here we go.
All right, there's a second. All in favor? All right. That's unanimous. Say again? This only, Councilman. All right, item C15.
Item C15, Mohammed Alazabalisa, 3218 Old Greensboro Road, located in the East Ward. Ordinance ordering the demolition and removal of a structure. Repairs more than 50% of the value of the structure.
Thank you. When this case was started, it was started under a different owner. There is a new owner now. The list pendants was filed July 25th of 2016, and the property became eligible for demolition on March 4th of 2017. It is in the minus 50, it's in the plus 50 category.
All right. And there's someone here to speak on that. Why don't you come to the podium and give your name and address for the record?
My name is Tawfiq Shahata, 113 Cameron Court in Advance, and I'm here to translate for Mr. Muhammad.
Okay. And as I mentioned to the gentleman before, if we take the action that is here today, it will provide a 90-day gap between the actual demolition of the property. Prior to that, staff goes back out to check the property and make sure that it has not been brought into compliance. Will 90 days be sufficient for you to make the repairs to the property?
If you allow me just for 1 minute, he just, the Syrian refugees just moved here 6 months ago with 8 kids. He just bought the house 2 months ago. He didn't know anything about it. So, but he was willing to fix it if you allow us more time.
The list pendants is pretty much, that's something that is filed, and it was filed in 2016, which is a record that states that this was a pending action against the property.
He didn't know. Even the lawyer did not tell him anything about it. He bought it 2 months ago. But he was willing to fix it, but 3 months, if we can allow us to have more time.
More than 3 months?
Please.
How much time does he think he needs?
I'm not familiar, but maybe 6 months or 4 months, whatever you can allow. He just moved here. He's working hard. He got 8 kids.
Mr. McIntosh?
I will speak to the fact that I have purchased properties and the list pendants has not shown up until down the road. So, I mean, it is possible to purchase a property and not have that discovered by the attorney during the closing process, and it's not necessarily a fault of the buyer. And I was asked by a member of the refugee community to see if we could give some leeway here. Do you think we could do a 90-day comeback, come back in 90 days and get a progress report on the work that's been done?
Well, if we did 90 days, then we would, I would be recommending we actually take the action that we have here. If we're not going to take that action, then I said we can hold this in committee, and I'm willing as a council member to hold this and have some conversation with you about it and see what we can figure out prior to coming back next month. And if not, we may hold it off and we can come to some resolution with staff. Okay, Mr.
Yeah, I would just recommend
please be sure that you get the full list of repairs? Because
Yes.
the list of unfits is not short. And some of them look to be significant items. I mean, the photos don't look too bad, but you can't see most of the stuff it references. So, like, new furnace or repaired furnace, fixed foundation, and some what looked like some major restroom repairs. So, I'd take a close look at those, make sure that that's all within the financial capability.
I think we're going to contact the inspector, and maybe he can guide us, tell us what do we need to do.
And if you would speak with Mr. Brooks before you go, that would be good.
So pretty much the action that we're taking, and without objection from the committee, is that we will hold this and allow opportunity for staff and others to get together to figure out what can be done. Okay.
So what do we need to do on our behalf? We come back or?
Get with Mr. Brooks, who's sitting right there.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay?
So we need a motion to hold this in committee for 90 days? Is that what we want?
No, not with 90 days, just without objection to hold it in committee.
Or just hold in committee, okay.
Yep.
I don't object, so we can,
And I'll check to see what his purchase date is in comparison to when the list pendants was filed. But according to this, the list pendants was filed on July 25th of last year. And I've run into a couple of situations where individuals are buying property without doing title searches. So if you don't do a title search, of course, it's not going to show up.
Okay.
in a case like this, would there be an action to avoid the transaction and get a refund? If it looks like it's just too much for them to, the required repairs are too much for them cost-wise?
I'd like to see what kind of contract he entered into with the property owner. I think that would be important for answering that question.
Because, Mr. Clark, aren't you required to disclose any known major defects?
Generally, you are, but again, this is a public record.
This is a what?
Of public record. So if you do a title search, according to this date, it was filed as of July 25th, 2016.
Yeah.
So while you have that responsibility to disclose certain things, again, this is still, if they bought it after this was filed, then it's a matter of public record, and they should have known about it if they had done a title search.
Would that take you to the list of repair requirements?
They normally, are you all footage?
He's outside.
Oh, you know.
Sometimes it'll just show
The complaint.
grass complaints or
With the housing cases, are you filing the complaint or the order? What exactly is being filed?
The order.
The order. The list of violations attached to the order?
It is, and we sent it to both the previous owner and to this gentleman. And the previous owner was just in the office. I just spoke with him right before I came in here. So he explained that if the repairs weren't done in 30 days, that he would make the repairs.
You know when he bought the property in relationship to when the...
I don't know when this gentleman bought the property.
Would you mind checking to be sure it has actually changed hands?
I'll be happy to.
Geodata actually shows the gentleman that was here today.
Is the,
Yes.
And it
The other guy
usually
may
has
have-
a transaction date. Did you look down and see the transaction date?
I didn't see the transaction date.
okay.
I'll check it.
All right.
All right. What about, if this gentleman is a recent refugee arrival, I would just be interested to make sure that we don't have some folks taking advantage of folks coming in and not understanding our system very well.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Item C17.
Item C17, Pamela A. Jordan, 2912 Wisner Court, located in the South Ward. Ordinance ordering the demolition and removal of a structure. Repairs more than 50% of the value of the structure.
Thank you. The due diligence by staff was done on this property as well. This is an older case located in the South Ward. The list pendants was filed 9/22 of 2016, and the property became eligible for demolition on May 5th, 2016. It is a plus 50 category.
Okay. I know there's someone here to speak on this. Sir, if you come to the mic, give your name and address for the record.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Fitzhugh. I reside at 2904 Wiesner Court.
Okay. And as a, well, go ahead. Thank you.
I just, on behalf of the neighbors in the general vicinity of this home, want to thank the committee for taking up this action today. We waited 10 years for this, so we want to thank you for that. We want to thank the council as a whole in anticipation of passage of this, and especially Councilman Larson for spearheading this. And after many years of frustration, we're just very grateful.
Well, thank you, sir. Yeah, pictures look pretty rough shape.
Pretty rough. It's a mess. This is a mess. I'd move approval.
Second. All right, have been moved and properly second. All in favor? That's unanimous. The item will go to Monday's full council meeting, and at that meeting, the actual order will go in effect once it's passed by council. And there is a 90-day time frame between our action and when the property will likely be demolished. Is that right, Mr. Brooks? Okay. All right. Item C18.
Item C18, Skyline Village Apartments, LLC, located at 31 Timlick Avenue in the East Ward. Ordinance ordering the demolition of a removal of a structure, repairs exceeding 65% of the value of the structure.
I asked for this item to be pulled, and particularly maybe Mr. Brooks, if you can be a bearer of a message. We've had issues with this property in the past, particularly in terms of code violations that range much deeper into many of the units within that property. At that time, we had reached out to the housing authority, in which they did challenge the property owner in reference to the fact that they have subsidies, federal subsidies on that property, and particularly in the fact that we take this action, which I will be supporting, that we then again follow back up with the housing authority to let them know that the action that I think it was either earlier this year or last year, in which they challenged them on making sure that they maintain the property, that they're not living up to that standard, and would ask that we would take every action to ensure that the entire complex is maintained on behalf of the residents there.
Very good. Well done.
Okay. All right. With that,
Move approval?
Okay.
Or, let me see what's up here. I'll do the motion.
Second.
I was going to say,
Okay.
this is that complex. Not
All right. Been moved and properly second. All in favor? That is unanimous.
Mr. Chair. There's another one. This is where that fire was last fall. Is that one still burn out
And at Skyline,
in that same complex?
I am not certain. That's not this unit.
This unit indicated fire damage.
So is it? I don't think. I'm.
Is this the one that was burnt out and has not been repaired?
I think it was. It is the same
Well,
one.
I'm not, I just don't know. Is it the same one? You know?
Is this the one we had the fire in this spring? Woman died in?
I'm not certain, Councilman. I haven't seen the actual unit myself.
Well, there's another one. We ought to look at that, too. Yeah.
But I can tell you that we've received 2 calls within the past 3 to 4 months where it's a potential purchaser has indicated that they're interested in purchasing it, and they are putting some information together to forward to us for review. So we believe that it's headed in that direction.
Okay. All right. All right. With that, we will go to the general agenda, item G1.
Item G1, presentation and resolution approving the assessment of fair housing and authorizing its submission to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Again, good afternoon. This particular item is a request to approve the assessment of fair housing and authorizing the submission to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we have mentioned on several occasions before that under the Fair Housing Act, HUD has required recipients who receive funds to certify that they're operating their program in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing, To accomplish this, there are certain regulations that we have to meet, and we have hired a consultant, Mosaic, that underwent this process of meeting with city staff and other stakeholders to go through a process to develop a strategy that can be attached to our submission in the consolidated plan this year. The Housing Authority, they are also required to do this assessment, and their submission date was a little later, but we have merged with them, and this consultant both did the assessment with the agreement of the city and the Housing Authority, which will go in as a consolidated process. And we are here today for the consultant to give you a presentation, a very brief presentation on the outcome of that assessment.
Okay. Question, Mr. Brooks, did we split that cost?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Mayu with Mosaic Community Planning, and our address is 195 Arizona Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. Like Mr. Brooks said, we were hired to work on an assessment of fair housing that covers the geographies of Winston-Salem and also Forsyth County. So basically that assessment studies patterns of integration and segregation, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, disparities in access to opportunity, and disproportionate housing needs. Those are kind of the four major umbrellas that HUD asks each one of their grantees to look at. As he also mentioned, this is required of any entitlement city or county that receives community development block grant money. They're required to complete this study. And HUD is also for the first time requiring them of public housing authorities. So this was a collaborative approach between the city, the county, and the housing authority, and I think worked really well having all three of those at the table. A brief overview of our process: we began with gathering community input and data, spent several months kind of doing data analysis and looking at some recommendations, and then finally over the past few months have been in that final phase of working on a draft, having it available for public review, and then now kind of towards the end of getting it approved. So just hitting each of those four areas pretty quickly. The first one looked at segregation and integration in the city and county. And you can kind of see from that map, the green dots represent African American population and the orange represents the white population. So you can kind of see a bit of a divide in the city, sort of along US 52. And looking at HUD has a method of calculating what they call dissimilarity index that looks at segregation. And according to that index, the city and county are both what they would call moderately segregated and have fallen in segregation levels over the past 30 years. So that's good news. The second area that the study looks at is concentrated areas of poverty. That's census tracts in the city or county where the majority of the population are people of color, and the poverty rate is over 40%. And you can see on that map, those are the areas in Winston-Salem and the county. There's no areas outside of Winston-Salem that qualify as concentrated areas of poverty. And you can't see it on that map, but we also looked kind of going back 1990 and 2000, and those have been kind of consistently areas of poverty and also where a majority of the population is people of color. The third area that HUD asks us to look at is areas of opportunity. What they describe is opportunity as access to quality schools, access to jobs, transit and transit costs, environmental health, and also living in a low poverty area. The findings there indicate that on average, white residents in the city and county live in neighborhoods that have better access to proficient schools, have lower poverty rates, and have better access to employment. Looking at some of the other factors, transit and environmental health, those were pretty much the same regardless of the race of residents. And then finally, housing need and race. What HUD defines as kind of housing need is affordability. So basically, if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, that would be considered a housing need. Within the city, African Americans are about 1.7 times as likely as white households to have a housing need, and Latinos are about 2 times as likely. So you can see a disproportionate need there by race. And then finally, homelessness also disproportionately affects African Americans, both in the city and county. So from these findings, and I think you have a copy of the report, there's lots of other data maps in there. We identified 8 different goals for the city, county, and HAWS to work on over the next 5 years. And as Mr. Brooks said, these are things that would be incorporated into their consolidated plan in a few months. So beginning, the first goal is community investment to increase opportunity in low-income areas. So over the next 5 years, kind of looking at some of those redevelopment projects that the city has planned. And just to let you know, these are a few bullet points for each one of those goals. I think the executive summary that you have and the report has more action items under each one of those, but I just wanted to highlight a couple. The second goal, looking at constructing affordable housing in high opportunity areas. So looking at tax credit applications or Habitat for Humanity construction that would be in neighborhoods with access to good schools, access to jobs, things like that. Another goal will be improving mobility for low-income residents, so helping folks be able to move throughout the city and county, maybe not be concentrated in certain neighborhoods where they might be able to use housing choice vouchers or something like that. So that's a goal for HAWS over the next 5 years, to kind of research and design mobility programs for their related to their vouchers, and also to explore ways to improve transportation options for low-income households, so they might be able to move in areas or not be restricted to areas where they have to take the bus. Also looking at expanding homeownership opportunities, continuing the city and county's homeowner assistance programs, and providing support, some financial support through the home and CDBG programs for for-sale housing production. The fifth goal, to protect existing housing stock, continuing the homeowner rehab program and supporting applications for multifamily rehab, things like that. The sixth goal specifically relates to the city's reasonable accommodation process. Our report found that your Unified Development Ordinance should be commended for having a reasonable accommodations process. There's cities and counties that don't have that. One of the things that we'd recommend is just adding some specificity to that, kind of in terms of how people make applications, what the timeline for that would be, things like that. Then the seventh goal, and I think this is something that the city does pretty strongly through their Human Relations Department, but continuing that over the next 5 years to host public forums, disseminate housing information, specifically working with immigrant and HOAs to get them more information about fair housing. And then the final goal, continue strategies to decrease homelessness, so working through the continuum of care, continuing to support emergency shelter facilities, and encouraging the development of supportive rental housing. So those are the 8 goals that were developed collaboratively with the city, county, and HAWS, and that the 3 will intend to work on over the next 5 years. But I can also take any questions that you might have.
Are there questions from committee and council? Ms. Carmen, point of order question for you.
I just was going to ask for a hard copy of the assessment and the presentation.
Sure, I think we can get you that.
Yeah, is this published somewhere? Can we get hard copies? It is. Okay, great.
Mr. Clark? Oh, sorry, Mr. Larson. What?
I have 3 children, some of them own their homes, some of them don't. I don't think home ownership is right for everyone, including some of my direct relatives there, for various reasons.
Sure.
How do you work that in? Because some people should not own their home. Some people should.
Sure. And I think that the city and county's programs take that into consideration, kind of doing financial training and working with clients before helping to put someone in a home. Because, yeah, you're certainly right that can kind of become more of an impediment than an assistance if it's not something you're ready for.
In one case, it really was for a while because they wanted to move a job that they had to sell before they did, and that was
sure, yeah.
That really was a ball and chain around the ankle for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McIntosh?
Yeah, I think in Winston, we don't have the problem of people who want to buy, who shouldn't buy, are buying. We have a problem with people who want to buy, who can't buy. And I know the IDA program and some of the efforts that the realtors have been involved with are very progressive and very well funded, but there's not as much uptake as I would have thought. And so knowing that, most people build equity and build wealth, most average people do that through the ownership of real estate, I'm highly in favor of that. But I agree, not everybody should own a house. That's commendable. I think the recognition now that if you're going to get somebody to buy a house, if you're going to induce somebody to buy a house, it's important to teach them how to take care of it. And I know Habitat has done that, has programs, and those kind of things I think are really important to partner along with.
Sure, and that wasn't in the points on the slides, but in that plan is also partnerships with Habitat.
A couple comments and questions. Looking at particularly HUD's push towards opportunity areas and investments in those areas, to me, sometimes is problematic in the sense of investment being pushed towards certain areas, which you get certain points for and it looks better, but then the areas that individuals are left in is not invested in, or you don't get the same kind of benefit from trying to reinvest in some of those areas. So how, and that's one of the areas that I think is a conundrum of sorts, in the sense that when you're looking at the HUD funding, how you can push certain things, what looks good in the eyes there, but then back in actual neighborhoods and communities, it almost looks as though in certain areas you may turn, that certain dollars are being turned away from those communities.
Sure. And I think that you're right. With this new model, HUD is looking a lot more at areas of opportunity. I think an important part of that, that maybe a lot of times people don't talk about as much, is that it also includes an imperative to work on improving opportunity in some of those low opportunity areas or the racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So I think that would all fall under that first goal of kind of working to increase opportunity in those neighborhoods with some of the, like the Choice Neighborhoods program or things like that, that the city is focusing in different neighborhoods.
The other are around two other areas, and it's under goals, and I'm sure there's some other things under there, particularly under around investing in housing. And one of them is Ridgewood and Emmanuel Retirement Village. Those are things that have already kind of underway, and so we're looking at 5 years, and we're looking at the longer term, real other opportunities to engage in that kind of work as well.
Sure, and I think you're right that there are some additional bullet points in there, and I think that's one of the things, I don't think I had it on the slide, but that's in the plan, is also for HAWS to look at possibilities of siting things outside of the city and kind of looking at expanding that.
Yeah. And the last comment, I guess, is for my colleagues, in the sense of us really taking a look at our policies. I know we have things in place that we put, particularly in and around rooming houses and boarding houses, particularly in residential zoning areas. But I do think we need to ask a very clear question around supportive housing and how that looks in certain communities. Because for some individuals, being able to be in a supportive housing environment is the only way that they're going to be able to be sustained. But I think we have to be able to truly identify what actually makes sense for these type of residential opportunities to exist that are not on the larger multifamily scale of housing, but do resemble what we've seen in terms of group home type settings for individuals that make sense for individuals that does not have the capacity to live independently nor the funds to live independently, but living in a group environment financially makes sense, as well as having supportive services in those type of settings. And I'm just not certain how well our policies incentivize any type of housing like that, and in what areas it does. Certainly, I know the concerns we've gotten and have had in the past around having rooming houses and group homes in a residential neighborhood, but when we want to ask that question of being able to create supportive housing doesn't always look like an apartment complex with X number of people in it, but it may be a home with 6 rooms that are rented specifically with services provided. And when we talk about housing, I think that's something that we have to take a look at. Do we actually allow for something like that to happen in our community if we're going to say we're going to push towards something like that? Any other questions? Mr. Larson?
I would like to compliment you on a very comprehensive document that I haven't been able to read entirely yet, and I look forward to having a hard copy of it. It's clearly going to be a roadmap for us to work on. I mean, I can see that already. How is this received at the federal level, and what are their expectations that this document will provide as far as evaluating the city or future grants or anything like that?
Okay. So this will be entered electronically and submitted to HUD. They'll review it and approve or give suggestions for changes if they see anything that needs to be changed. But basically from that plan at the end, that will help inform the city's consolidated plan as they go forward. And then every year as they report on that in their CAPER, it will include those things. And through the consolidated plan, they'll be included and then reported on each year in the CAPER.
So we can anticipate that they will evaluate our progress based on the recommendations of this plan?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Are there any other comments? We'll need a motion and a second from the committee. Although this item does not have any funding associated with specific organizations, I will abstain from voting for the potential that it could be used for funding, how funding is driven in the future, and to avoid any potential conflict that may arise.
We've been doing actually motions to excuse.
I'd make a motion we excuse Mr. Montgomery from voting on G1.
Second.
Aye. It's not in the piece, we got to go aye.
Those in favor?
Yep,
Okay.
we said aye.
All right, it's unanimous. All right, y'all. Cool. The Vice Chair isn't here, so.
Hang on a minute, let me second. It's not on the light.
We record that electronically.
I don't think we want to catch it since we haven't edited him previously.
She'll know that from our records.
Yep, but it's still not.
Okay. I second it. Did you? I made it. Yeah, mine says.
What's coming up?
We talked too long.
Are you showing the second?
There we go.
Okay. I didn't get a chance to vote.
Nobody voted.
Verbal.
Let's just do that one.
Yeah, so
Aye.
Aye for G1.
We're good.
that's 2 in favor, 1 abstaining. Item G2.
Item G2, ordinance amending chapters A and B of the Unified Development Ordinances to amend and update the Airport Overlay District, UDO 274, proposal of the City County Planning and Development Services staff, recommended by Planning Board. Item continued from the August 15th, 2017 Community and Development Housing General Government Committee.
Good afternoon, council members. I am Steve Smotherman of the Planning and Development Services staff, and I'm going to present a brief summary of UDO 274, which is a request to amend the airport overlay district standards. It's basically, I view it more as a cleanup amendment. It's sort of keeping it up to date. The airport overlay district was created initially to follow Federal Aviation Administration regulations for the protection of aircraft and structures in the vicinity of Smith Reynolds Airport by allowing for the FAA and the airport to review proposed developments in or near flight paths. This ordinance amendment would explicitly require notification to the FAA and airport when structures are proposed that could be potential airspace obstructions, but it will not prevent development. The permit would be issued, but it would be delayed. That notification gives the FAA and the airport an opportunity to work with applicants on the impact of structures to the airport or negotiate the purchase of a property or an easement or work out some arrangement for the future. This amendment, like I said, updates the airport overlay standards through minor changes and clarifications. The boundaries of the district are already established in the UDO and are from the 1982 Smith Reynolds Airport and Approach Vicinity Map. The amendment changes the reference to a more recent updated map so that we're not having to officially work from a fuzzy blueprint. And this is a picture of the airport overlay district. Again, it already exists. It goes from Business 40 in the southern portion up to US 52 near Germantown Road, goes to the edge of Walkertown, and downtown is on the edge of the lip of the overlay district boundaries. The main provision of the airport overlays require applicants to notify the FAA of proposed structures that might be taller than 150 feet in height. And the permits are not issued for sites in the airport overlay until the FAA has issued a finding on the impact of the structure, which usually takes about 90 days, or if 120 days have passed, a building permit is issued. And again, that is in the existing ordinance as well. And permits are based on the minimum height for the FAA airport notification. Very few structures will require their review because the zoning district in that area is mostly residential and some general business and highway business, which most of these have a zoning height limit of 60 feet or less. So there would be very few structures that would even activate this requirement. So it most likely would be cell towers or downtown high rises in the eastern portion of downtown, and that would be it. The amendment also requires for all development, not just tall structures in runway protection zones, which are at the edge of the runways, to also notify the FAA and the airport before permits are issued. And like I said, the RPZs are small areas at the end of each runway that ensures takeoff and landing safety. Again, this will be subject to the same 120-day requirement as with the airspace obstructions. This amendment also reorganizes the ordinance to make it easier to use, removes an enforceable provision requiring removing trees on private property whether or not you're getting a permit, and also allows for smaller trees to meet the planting requirements in the runway protection zone. So what you see is proposed will make it clearer and easier to administer, but again, it does not change at all the existing ordinance. It just clarifies things and makes it clearer. And again, in the past 4 or 5 years, it has not come into effect and likely may or may not in the next 10 years. So this is a fairly simple ordinance just to take care of extreme instances where it might affect the height of airport traffic around the airport. and it was brought to the planning board with no opposition, and the planning board recommended approval.
Any questions?
And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I'm trying to really understand what we're doing here. What the original purpose was intended to prohibit the erection of structures which would, because of their height, become airport hazards and interfere with airport operations at Smith Reynolds. Is that not the purpose anymore? To protect, it says to prohibit the erection. We're not doing that anymore.
Well, we're trying to do that through contact through the FAA, because they certainly wouldn't want that.
The FAA doesn't have veto power on construction of buildings within this zone we're talking about right now. All they can do is render an opinion, but they do not have a final say on whether or not a building is to be built in the airspaces that are being impacted.
Correct.
That's correct. And so that to me seems to be a fairly significant change. Is it not? I mean, this is what I'm trying to figure out what exactly are we accomplishing here. I noticed throughout this document, some of the words are like, let me see if I can just find one. It says, new and expanding structures or land uses. No person shall construct or expand a structure which could extend above. So, which could. I mean, I'm not clear on that language.
The could would be if they submit a plan that for a 200-foot high tower.
Well, that does then. That does extend above.
Correct.
I mean, if we're saying, either we have a cap or a ceiling here.
But it is the 150-foot ceiling. And we're just saying that some of those permits might exceed that. We're not trying to say, be arbitrary and say, well, this could, and we would have that come into play.
Well, and then the other question I had going through this, and I got to tell, this is a rather dense document, and trying to wade through it. This is not my committee, so you guys will have to decide. But exceptions, for example, it says these regulations shall not apply to any navigational facility, airport, visual approach or landing aid, airport arresting device, or any type, and you eliminate that. So you're saying that the airport has no authority anymore to control these as exceptions to the rule. Is that
the exceptions? Most of those would be erected by the airport. That's what it's
right. Well, are they not exempt then?
Yes, and they're just clarifying that.
Where does it say that in this regulation?
It may not say it, but we can add that if that's.
Well, this is what I'm struggling with. Is I'm trying to understand exactly what has changed here, and why we are doing this. What is the intent that we're trying to accomplish? I understand trying to clean up the language and make it easier and more accessible. And some of the tree issue is very clear to me. I'm less clear on understanding what the other parts of this is accomplishing. It's not either notifying the FAA, notifying Smith Reynolds, notifying the inspection department. All that's already in there.
It's implicit in there. This makes it more explicit that they have to notify it.
It was pretty clear when I read it. When I was reading what was actually scratched out, and trying to understand, is that all we're doing here? Is just, can somebody tell me exactly what?
That plus we're making reference to a more recent airport overlay on which the district is based.
Well, the mapping is clear.
Mapping.
You're making reference to that, and I understand that. But that's a technical. That's not really an ordinance change. That's an administrative cleanup, I would think. But maybe.
And that's what I tried. I said this is mostly cleanup.
Approval on the new map. We can look at that. But maybe this is clear to some of my colleagues. But as I read through this, trying to understand why we're actually doing this, I struggled to understand what it was so significant that we're actually implementing these. It seemed that. Is anybody from the airport here to talk about this and what it means to them?
They have reviewed this and they were okay with it. So,
all right. Councilman McIntosh.
I had a question about the RPZ zone. RPZ. So on the map with the purple lines on it.
Yes.
Where on that map? What defines the RPZ? Is it discernible from?
It is defined based on the length of the runway. That's done by FAA and the airport.
Okay.
So the longest runway is going to the southeast, so that's number C. And so that's defined based on length of the runway.
Okay.
And that is what's new, that Olin doesn't talk about any development in the runway protection zone.
And my concern was the impact on trees and whether we were going to be too broad and where we were going to limit the height of trees. So I'm good with that. Thanks.
Mr. Clark?
The way I'm reading it, if you, and it's probably going to be a cell tower more than a building. If somebody puts a 160-foot cell tower up and an approach path to the runways, they got to notify the FAA.
Correct.
And I think that's a good idea. I don't see what matter of fact, I'm surprised the FAA doesn't have some type of authority there. But I can't imagine anyone building a tower if the FAA says you're potentially interfering with an airplane and an airplane hits and then they're going to get sued for that.
I think there are regulations for cell towers that have to meet the FAA requirements.
Oh, okay.
So that brings in the lighting and all that. But there are some places that they just can't do it. But that has to go through FAA.
Okay.
But so I think the main effect of this is just to clarify when you have buildings in this area that puncture that imaginary line that is going up and away from the airport, and you have buildings that puncture that conical surface, then you have to have FAA and airport review of that so that they can then negotiate with them about mitigation strategies. Some of it may just be as simple as lighting of it.
And downtown would be the most obvious place you would put up and that's about a 10, 12-story building, I think, 150 feet.
Probably closer to 20-story, actually. It's there are only 3 buildings. It's the flag mast of the R.J. Reynolds Historic Building, top 60 or 70 feet of the Winston Tower, and the Wells Fargo Building.
Okay.
And if you notice at night, the R.J. Reynolds and Winston Tower have flashing lights on top, and the dome of the Wells Fargo Building is lit up at night.
Okay. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? What's the pleasure of the committee?
I'm going to move.
I'll second, and perhaps Mr. Larson could confer with staff further between now and the meeting about
A few details would be useful on the way this ordinance is written.
Okay, all right. All in favor?
Wait a minute. There we go.
That's unanimous. Item G3.
Item G3, ordinance amending Chapter B of the Unified Development Ordinances to amend regulations for buffer yards, UDO 280, proposed by the Planning and Development Services staff, recommended by the Planning Board.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My presentation open. Laptop. Okay. UDO 280, Planning and Development Services. We're here to request to amend regulations for buffer yards. Buffer yards are planting areas that provide visual and functional separation between land uses for the sake of reducing potential nuisances, safeguarding property values, preserving community character, and also protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Legacy 2030, our comprehensive plan, recommended that we revise our standards for buffer yards in order to promote better integration of uses and also to improve the user-friendliness of the ordinance as it was written. Currently, we have 4 buffer yard types, which range from low to high-density screens. And the type of buffer yard is determined by the intensity of adjacent land uses. In the proposed ordinance, we are recommending to eliminate the type 4 buffer yard because it's very similar to type 2.
Also to standardize the buffer widths to 10, 20, 40, and 100 feet, except for in the type 3, we thought that a 10-foot buffer yard would likely cause crowding, plant crowding. Also, we are looking to eliminate the internal buffer requirements for zoning lots that have split zoning, but we would maintain the buffers for the adjoining properties. And we would treat single zoning lots with manufactured housing zoning as single-family residential, considering the relative nature. On this chart, you see all of the buffer yard types, 1, 2, and 3, and their widths. And with each, you see the number of required plantings. We require deciduous trees, canopy trees, evergreens, and shrubs. The numbers correlate to the minimum number of plants required per 100 linear feet. And on the chart, those that are highlighted in yellow are those where we increase the number of plantings. Most of them we did increase the number of plantings, particularly the evergreens, which provide a strong visual screen. Here we have some conceptual visuals of what the buffer yards look like, 1, 2, and 3, at the various widths with the plants included. As you go from type 1 to type 3, you see how the density increases and the thickness of the plantings. I will say that the buffer yard does not require that the plants be planted in a strip as you see they are here. They could be more spatially dispersed, but that's just for the visual. Further analysis, changes for the type 2 buffer yard, which is the one you see most frequently used. This would be where, say, multifamily may be next to single-family housing in other situations. For the type 2 buffer yard, we reduced the minimum buffer yard width by 5 feet from 15 to 10-foot minimum. This, we thought, would increase the site design flexibility, particularly on smaller urban sites where you would get more developable space on the land. Although we did provide a smaller minimum width, we did increase the number of primary evergreen plants by 50% at the 10-foot and 20-foot widths, which we thought would help to provide an adequate site screening. We did have a landscape architect review the ordinance, and it was determined that the widths adequately screen adjoining properties while accommodating better integration of neighboring uses, which was recommended in our comprehensive plan. Other proposed buffer yard regulations include requiring a buffer yard in a thoroughfare overlay the TO district instead of a street yard to provide a good, strong buffer on these highly trafficked corridors. And we also are allowing developers to apply for alternative compliance for a proposed buffer yard plan that differs from the specific requirements of the ordinance. This would be to accommodate unique characteristics, which could be topography or elevation changes, existing retaining walls of vegetation, or to allow the developer to utilize innovative design. The proposal would be on a case-by-case basis, but it would have to meet the intent of the standard buffer yard requirements and would have to be approved by the Director of Plan and Development Services or his designee. If an appeal is desired, it would go and be heard by the Board of Adjustment. In summary, we did consult with the city's Vegetation Management Department, and they believe that the proposed requirements should allow for healthy plant growth and longevity. As staff, we believe the proposed amendment will allow for better blending of uses while providing adequate screening for adjacent properties. We also believe that each buffer yard type adequately screens adjoining properties according to their purpose statements. We did hold a stakeholder meeting on May 30th to present the ordinance and to hear concerns from citizens, and the Planning Board held a public hearing and recommended the text amendment for approval on June 8th. Questions?
Are there questions from the committee or members of council present? Mr. Larson?
What were the comments you heard in your May meeting?
In the May meeting, there were some concerns we invited citizens, particularly neighborhood associations, also members of the design and development community, but they did not attend. But some of the citizens were just concerned about the type 2, the minimum width being decreased, They were concerned about a commercial or a multifamily use being somewhat closer to a neighboring residential property. Also, that was the largest concern, just trying to visualize how this might actually look and play out for them. But we did discuss that we beefed up the number of plantings, which should provide a good screen. And in that, buffer yards are to provide visual screen as well as a spatial separation.
Mr. McIntyre?
I'm having a hard time visualizing the impact of 15 feet versus 10 feet with more density. I mean, is staff saying that those are roughly equivalent in the amount of buffering separation they provide between different uses? A 15-foot space,
yes,
which is currently type 2, right? Allowing that to reduce down to 10, but with more dense vegetation requirement?
Yes, the vegetation, the number of plantings would be increased to offset that the width is less, but it does provide more developable space.
And the reason, again, is thinking to our comprehensive plan. We are trying to make better use of land in our urban core. And of course, well, a number of the lots in those areas are smaller. And so reducing the buffer by 5 feet, but still having the same effective screening value of the buffer would put more of those properties into play to be able to be developed or in some way redeveloped. So we felt that would assist in getting more development into the older parts of the city that
right.
would have otherwise gone undeveloped or maybe abandoned.
Right. On a 10,000 square foot lot, 5 feet along all, well, would be along all four edges, would be 2,000 square feet, which is 20% of the lot coverage that you could utilize better. I'm just really, staff feels pretty confident that a 10-foot buffer with increased density of vegetation equals the same amount of buffering as a 15-foot with less vegetation.
We had a landscape architect who's not on staff look at it and say, is the quality of this buffer in terms of screening value the same, and can the plants grow in this area? And their response back to us was yes, it was. They made some suggestions about how we tinker with the language there, so we did. But we believe we've seen some examples where that could make a difference in the usability of that. And I think we did some pictures too. We got some pictures off the back end of this that can show you some examples of the different kinds of screening with the different types of buffers there, so you can see what it looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Best?
I have been scrolling back and forth in the ordinance to try to find any place that it references change from 15 to 10 other than on page 10, 3-1.2, parens J, parens 2, parens B, where it talks about reducing the side yard setbacks from 15 to 10 feet minimum when you're putting in where you have a PB zone adjacent to an RS or an RSQ zone. Is there another place that I'm missing that talks specifically to the definition of buffering or to the standards for a buffer?
Good afternoon, council members. The main place that this is in table B.3.14, where it goes through the types of buffer yards. And the version that I have doesn't have page numbers. But if you go down, look at that where it says type 2 buffer yard design options, you'll see underneath that minimum buffer yard width, and you'll see 15 feet is stricken, and there's 10 feet underscored next to that. That would be the place that it occurs there, where there was the change of width from 15 feet down to the 10 feet.
Still with you.
It's on page
13, bottom of the page.
Yeah.
It's a chart called Type 2 buffer
Yeah.
yard
Okay,
design
no.
option.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I think it would have been helpful, either some actual examples or some theoretical examples, I think would be very helpful.
We do have a couple examples some lots across the city that we brought up to provide a look of this visually. Here we have a office site on Polo Road 2255. It is an office there abutting residential. Currently, there is a building and parking lot. With the proposed Type 2 10-foot buffer, there would be able to maintain the parking on the east side of the building, and also would be able to not have to cut out as much asphalt on this site on the south side. If you can tell the 15-foot buffer and the 10-foot buffer and the dotted lines there. So it makes this a little bit more usable site without having to make as many alterations on it. And we also have another site. This is an undeveloped site on South Stratford Road. We'll say approximately 200 by 200. Currently, there would be a Type 2 15-foot buffer required, but with the Type 2 10-foot buffer, with that reduction, they would increase the developable area by 2,750 square feet, which provides extra space for building, to be able to move the building around, parking, and to work with that site. Okay. And then we have one more. It is would be a home office conversion on Country Club Road. It's a home, as you see there. This site is currently probably undevelopable due to the fact that a drive would have to be required around the site. The home is only about 25 feet from the eastern property line. And if they had to have a 15-foot buffer plus a 12-foot drive width, they likely would be unable to utilize this site. But with the 10-foot buffer, it provides a little bit more space for a driveway around the building, and then this site could actually be utilized. Yes, sir.
So we're saying we're encouraging the conversion of a private residence into commercial operation?
Well, there's already commercial zoning on this
How's it
property.
functioning?
I'm not sure what's being had in the building right now, but it does have, currently is commercially zoned.
So it's functioning under the current zoning as a commercial building without these changes?
Currently, the way the site is configured may not be actually under the current requirements for the drive width and whatnot. So it may not.
Just to add a little further on that, my understanding is this is a site that just has general use, non-residential zoning, and that zoning has existed since prior to UDO, and it just converted into one of the UDO districts at this point since it's surrounded in an area of larger scale office buildings. But to our knowledge, this is still operating as a residence like some commercially zoned residences in these similar transitional areas are. But really this was just to illustrate how this is something that's actually recommended in the West Suburban Area Plan as the transition to an office use at this location. And this was just to show that by adopting this ordinance and allowing for more flexibility, you can actually retain more of the vegetation on this site and have a one-way loop driveway rather than what you would have to do under the current ordinance, which is take down a lot of that vegetation on the right side of the photograph to allow for circulation on that side of the property.
This is right across the street from the Masonic Temple, the new Masonic Temple, isn't it? Country Club?
Yes, it is.
It's pretty dense.
Okay. Mr. Larson?
Could you work a little bit with me on the reference to shallow lots and sort of the 150 requirement that's listed in there, less than 150, and then the applicable roads and boundaries, section C, which talks about 100 feet on either side on that. trying to understand the dimension of these lots and exemptions. I think this is under the exemption section, where if a lot is 100 feet, less than 100 feet deep. Am I understanding that correctly? 150 feet, less than 150 feet deep.
Where is that in here, John?
This is shallow lots under exemptions. This is page 3 of 21 pages.
3 on there.
Yeah, page 3.
2-1.6.
I don't know, it's ID. It's number 4 under exemptions.
2-1.6. B2. B.
Okay, what that is saying, and again, this is some language that we didn't modify or examine as part of this ordinance. This is in the existing TO standards, but what it's saying is that if you're in those urban or suburban growth management areas, GMA 1, 2, or 3, and you have less than 150 feet of depth, and depth being basically from the thoroughfare such as Business 40 or 421 40 to the property line, or if you're in those more rural areas, GMAs 4 and 5, you have 200 feet of depth, you should be exempt from the provisions of this section, except that these lots are required to meet the 10-foot setback for parking off the right-of-way. So in other words, you wouldn't have to do those plantings along the right-of-way that we're talking about. You would just have to have the 10-foot setback and the street yard on the street side, not the thoroughfare side.
So the buffers would not apply.
Correct.
On a residential lot, if you're backing up against a residential lot, on one of these shallow lots, on either the back side or one long side, none of these rules would apply.
Well, no, by definition, the TO district lots back up to a designated thoroughfare such as Business 40, 421, or I-40. So the purpose of the TO ordinance when it was created in 1994 was to screen the view of the thoroughfares from uses that may be taking place on this property. So there's not any loss or any effect one way or another on residential property. This whole TO provision is really about the relationship between what vehicles see on those thoroughfares as they pass the backs of these sites.
Okay, so just explain to me then, what is the buffer zone on that house, on that lot, on that small lot? Just on the highway side?
It would be on the highway side. Now, if, for example, there's a property that's residentially zoned adjacent to it on one side or the other, then there would be a buffer yard required there, separate from the TO ordinance, and there's no waiver to that. In other words, they would still have to do a buffer to a side adjacent residential regardless of lot depth.
For a different residential.
Exactly.
Change the zoning use.
This is just as it relates to that special TO overlay district requirement.
Got that. Thank you. I've got to say, from what I've heard from my constituents, they are happy with the trees controls. They are not as comfortable with type 2 changing from the 15-foot to the 10-foot. Type 1 has 10-foot. Type 2 should have 15. Type 3, 20. And that seemed to be a logical progression of density and distances involved in those two types, those three types in gradation of density or buffer being created. It is not just sight lines, it's sound, light, a variety of other things that spatial distances seems to make is what I'm hearing. And I think as this has been discussed before in the public hearings, it's been brought up in planning board meetings, and it's been brought up as you mentioned, in the forums that the residents participated in. And I've heard nothing different in the course of the last several months to indicate that opinion has changed. And I would request once again that we evaluate type 2 from the 10 back to the 15 where it was before. And I'd probably vote that way if it came up. I'm not on this committee, So, but I have severe reservations based on what I'm hearing from my constituents, and I think we'll hear it in public hearing as well.
Mr. Bessie?
When would, if we move this to the full council, when would it come for hearing?
It is scheduled for the first council meeting in October.
The feedback that you've heard, Ms. Boston, is that something that could be changed by a fairly straightforward amendment? It seems that way to me.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of this committee or whatever we're going to send forward to full council. I think if we dealt with that 15 and 10 issue, which has been festering out ever since this was proposed, I think most opposition would probably evaporate on it. But it's significant enough that the type 1 and the type 2 at that basic entry level remains at 10 feet. I mean, I personally have a question about whether you can plant a major canopy tree, and I know you've got experts that have looked at it, but a canopy tree in a 10-foot zone and expect, it not to impact adjacent properties. And, we need enough space in there to allow that sort of thing to happen. I think it's a 15-foot question on type 2 is my main concern about this.
I just was thinking, if it was a complex issue that needed to be worked up for presentation, then I'd recommend that we hold it. If it's straightforward, either A or B, within the context of a larger change, we could send it on and just anticipate an amendment vote on council.
Can I get clarification on something?
Mr. McIntosh?
If we were thinking about going back to a 15-foot, would there be relief from that under certain circumstances? Could that be appealed?
The way this is written, they can appeal directly to the planning director and on a case-by-case basis.
Paul, will you speak to that?
There would have to be special circumstances for that particular property, like topography, physical features that would mitigate the need for the full buffer as called for in the ordinance. And so that case-by-case review would have to look at the specifics of it. Is there a retaining wall involved? Is there steep topography involved where the strict application of the ordinance wouldn't really make any difference in that? On those cases, then a variation could be approved, and if somebody did not agree with whatever that decision was, then they could appeal it to the Board of Adjustment.
What about if the neighbor said it was okay? What about if the neighboring property was okay with a 10-foot instead of 15-foot?
I think there'd have to be something more written in the ordinance to provide for that. If it wasn't a special circumstance based on topography, but simply a neighbor was okay with it, I think the ordinance would probably have to have some different language in there, because I don't know that, given the current language, I would certainly feel comfortable with making a variation just because the neighbor said it was okay.
Mr. Clark?
I think the challenge we have is, with rare exceptions, there's no two lots that are the same, and this is a somewhat hilly town. And in some cases, 10 feet won't do it. In some cases, 15 wouldn't. So I think whatever we adopt, there ought to be some type of review or exception, and maybe that is the Board of Adjustment. We just had a restaurant built out in the West Ward, and the land beside it is probably 15 or 20 feet above it. It's been dug out. So with that case, I'm not sure what good it would do planting a 15-foot tree. So the point being that there's just exceptions to everything, and I'm not sure where that house is when I'm going to go look at it. But if that house had been built somewhere different on the lot, it would change the whole scenario. So I think we need something that protects the neighbors, but at the same time has some type of review for exceptions, because this, in certain places in this town, the topography and other issues would certainly come into play.
Okay. With that being said, it sounds more so that there are some additional things that we may need to bring back in reference to some of the exception conversation and even some of the comments from Mr. Larson. And is there any anything out there that we need to move any quicker on this action?
Well, there's no time pressure
Yeah.
to change this, so if the committee wants to discuss this again with some other options, that can certainly happen, or if you feel like it's just a simple amendment, that if the majority of the council wants to make that amendment on the floor on October 2nd, that's a possibility too. Or if you'd like us to explore widening the boundaries for variations to be made, we could look at that and bring some language back.
Oh, and unless the committee objects, it'd be my preference that we would hold it, get some more specifics, and send something more whole to council, absent of the amendments, because I'm hearing two different things in terms of we're looking at two additional things, and so that'd be a bit more to deal with. Mr. Larson?
Could I ask one more question while we're looking at this, and so people are informed? There's a component in here about fencing and walls or whatever, hard surfaces within these buffer zones, and the placement of plant material on either side of that fence. Could somebody elaborate on exactly what the application of that would mean in relationship to where those hard surfaces are placed and where the plant material is placed in relationship to that?
Let me just read the ordinance language for all council members in the audience here. It's under B3, fence or wall option. An opaque fence or wall may be used in lieu of not more than 50% of the required evergreen buffer yard plantings with the approval of the Director of Planning and Development Services or designee. And there's also conditions. The first of which is if it's a fence height for industrial zoning, it has to be 8 feet. If it's a fence for other zoning, it has to be 6 feet. The vegetation has to be planted on the exterior sides of the fence to help screen it from adjoining properties. And where the fence option is used to screen multifamily residential zoning types from more intense zoning types, the vegetation may in that case actually be planted on the interior side of the wall, since it's designed to soften the appearance of the fence. So where you're doing something more intense than the residential neighbors, the planting goes next to the residence and then the fence. But in that multifamily scenario where you're next to industrial or something of that nature, then the fence can be against the hard edge and the planting can be on the inner edge. So it's not meant to take the place entirely of the vegetation on the site, but it's a way in more tight sites or sites where it might be easier or more aesthetically pleasing to do a fence to add some of that flexibility that it sounds like the council is hoping to see in this ordinance.
Yeah, I would like consider, because what that separates is the planting zone from the owner, and you end up with a 10-foot planting zone with a fence behind it. The owner's separated from that planting zone for maintenance of the planting zone, for the space involved for large tree plantings. If that fence material goes up, I think also we have something to look at there as far as long-term maintenance and spatial use and development of that area over time. You know, that was another question I think that was raised in the May meeting, as I recall. So we could look at a couple of those things.
Yeah, I'll ask Mr. Larson and staff and have some more conversation there. Mr. McIntyre?
Will this only come into play when someone is asking for a rezoning? Because if you're already zoned,
I would
still
have
to
check,
comply, right?
but I believe there may be some situations where buffer yards are actually required if there's a change of use. That's my understanding, is that certain change of uses to high-intensity uses could actually trigger the installation of a buffer yard.
And change of use is not a public process, right? That's through
Correct.
staff.
That's just done at the staff administrative zoning level.
I guess my thought was that the vast majority of these are going to be in cases where there will be a public review process, a public comment process.
Well, actually, the vast majority of these probably would be in general use zoning districts. Maybe not the vast majority, but certainly some would be going through council where there was a rezoning taking place. But any time where there's already development that's zoned for something, for example, this what was on the screen earlier, the single-family home that already has general use zoning, that would just bring its site plan to the staff in our zoning review department, and there would be no public hearing or elected body review or planning board review. They would just have to have all UDO requirements, including that buffer yard.
To me, I think the heartburn comes in where it's abutting traditional residential RS9 usage. And in those circumstances, I think we would be going through a public process, right? So you would have input and the ability to weigh in as a neighborhood against that change. And if a developer wanted to say, well, in order to get the deal done, I'll go from 10 foot back to 15 foot. I mean, those kind of accommodations are done in other circumstances. I mean, if this were a staff level approval, I would not support this by any means. But the fact that it's going to take place in most cases in circumstances where neighborhoods are concerned, neighborhoods will have the opportunity to weigh in on it. And I think council listens to those things. So that makes me a little less sort of frightened of it.
All right, with that said, we're going to hold this in committee, send it back to your staff. You heard the comments from council, from the committee, and we can bring back some response to that, and I'd ask individual council members if they have additional concerns to have some conversation with staff. All right? Thank you all very much. Is there anything else anyone else has? One thing I'm going to ask, Mr. City Manager, was in part to comment I mentioned earlier around rooming houses and boarding and group homes. Since the impact of our change in zoning in terms of moving out boarding houses in residential zones, bringing back some information on how many actual cases have we had were requests for actual zoning of those properties, and if we can actually kind of get a sense of how many boarding houses or more so group homes do we actually have in the community, just as an assessment in terms of we're asking questions around supportive housing. That's a question I wonder, is it something that our code actually really incentivizes in any way?
I think we could also, Chairman, bring back a report on the reasonable accommodation clause that was mentioned, and maybe we need to tighten that up as well, because that language is very helpful for supportive housing.
All right, and I'm not saying we're trying to go and rehash the rooming house issue, but just more so if that's something we're looking at, where does it make sense if we haven't seen it happen? Paul?
Mr. Chairman, just so I'm sure what we're looking at here, what I understand you're asking for is the rooming house provisions that were done a number of years ago by council. You want to know how many or if there have been rezoning requests to allow new rooming houses in different zoning districts since then. Is that okay?
And the other question, I don't know whether zoning category applies to, if that's the same thing a group home would fall under or not, and if not, in the sense of kind of saying where those lie in the community, kind of this specific
family group home, A, B, and C,
right,
things like that.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All right. With that being said, we'll consider the meeting adjourned. Public Works.
Public Works will convene at 6:15, please.